I'd like to begin by telling you what I've been doing for the last several days, weeks, months. Since the COVID problem began, I have been home. I've been home alone with my girlfriend. This is wonderful. And we have only been married for 55 years, so we're doing very, very well. Um, Also, as you can tell, I've been exercising every day. I've been practicing the piano, not just playing the piano, and I've been working. My model, my inspiration has been Isaac Newton. Remember him, the greatest physicist, he and Einstein, the greatest physicist who ever lived. During the plague, Isaac Newton stayed home. He stayed home in his own house, didn't go out, etc. He had always been a mediocre student at Cambridge, but while he was home, let me tell you what he did. He invented calculus. He started the study of modern physics. He did brilliant work in optics, brilliant work in studying gravity and how it works. This has been similar. This has been an amazing time. There has been a lot of suffering with COVID. Uh, for me, it has been a magnificent time because of being home, as I told you, with my girlfriend, and also getting so much exciting work done. And I'm very happy to report it to you today. Um, Let me tell you what has been happening on Friday mornings with me in Southern California. And this has also been very career changing for me. Every Friday morning at the local grocery store, they have a special time when you can go shopping for old people only. And I qualify for that now. So the first time I did that, early in the morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, I took all my groceries and I got into line to the cashier. And I noticed that the cashier had his name written on his shirt, and it was a Hispanic name. His name was Fidel. Now, my Spanish is not my best language. It's like number four. But I spoke to him in Spanish. He answered in English, which is what they are asked to do. I was ready. I'll tell you what I said. And I said this all in Spanish. I said, Fidel, please, you can help me. Tú puedes ayudarme. I said, one of my goals is to speak Spanish the way you do. Quiero hablar español como ustedes. And I said, please help me. Let's speak Spanish. Hablamos español. He was so happy. He answered me in Spanish, and we had the first of many, many conversations. Now, I've been having conversations with Fidel for over the last year, and I have gotten better. Here's how I know. First of all, he talks more quickly. We talk about more interesting things. In Spanish, instead of just hablar, to speak, it's charlar, which means to talk about other people and have a good time. Who was it who said, if you don't have anything good to say about someone, come sit next to me? Okay. So we have a lot of interesting conversation. He's speaking more quickly to me. He's using more idiomatic expressions. I'm certainly getting better. And occasionally, I've been speaking Spanish to some of my Mexican American friends. And one of them told me recently, Steve, your Spanish is so much better. What are you doing? It's not from talking to Fidel. I only talk to Fidel maybe 1 minute once a week. That's not enough to make any difference at all. When I go home after going to the supermarket, I read in Spanish. I've been taking the advice of my colleague Benico Mason, and I've been reading lots and lots of very easy books in Spanish, what we call graded readers, books written for people acquiring the language. The good news is that graded readers, I'd say in the last 10 years, and thank you publishers for this, they have become literature. They've become much more interesting. I have favorite authors now in Spanish. I can read real Spanish, authentic, but it's difficult. When I find a really good author, it's okay, but it's a little hard. I'm getting better now. I'm getting to the point where real Spanish is not so tough anymore. And it's only from pleasure reading, these graded readers, which, as I said, are getting better and better and better, and I am improving. This is the only thing I'm doing. I'm not studying grammar. I'm not speaking more. I'm only reading these easy books, and a lot of them from favorite authors. I have just given my entire talk. That is the talk today. I'm now going to repeat it in a much more boring way because that's what you're supposed to do as an academic. And let me give you the theoretical version of what I just said. And this is the next slide, the one that says brief review of theory. So next slide, please. Okay. Here's what we have concluded after the last, oh gosh, 40 years, 45 years of research. We acquire language in only one way. We acquire language by understanding it. That's what happens when I read these easy books. Our ability to speak is the result of language acquisition. We have confused cause and effect in language acquisition and in language arts in general. You don't get better in speaking by speaking. You get better by getting input, by reading and listening, okay? We don't get better by study. Now, I have to confess to you, like many of you, I love studying grammar. My PhD is in linguistics. One of my great heroes, of course, is Noam Chomsky. In reading these theoretical works on English syntax, I find it absolutely fascinating. This is not why I'm getting better. This is different. Grammar, knowledge of grammar, knowledge about language does not help you speak fluently. It's only available to us as an editor. While you're writing, while you're talking, if you think you're about to make a mistake, you can pause, you can reevaluate what you did, think of the grammar rules and make corrections. So grammar helps you as an editor, as a monitor. Now, to do this, you have to meet certain conditions, and they're very, very hard to meet. Number one, you have to know the rule. Now, one thing that Noam Chomsky will tell you, one thing that the famous linguists will tell you, is that we don't know all the rules of language. Chomsky says we have only described fragments of language. They're still studying, trying to figure out the rules, etc. So if you want to use grammar and make corrections in what you say and what you write, you've got to know the rule. And this makes it very hard. In order to do that, you've got to be thinking about rules. You have to be thinking about correctness. It's very hard to do this when you're having a conversation. Number three, you have to have time. It takes time to find the grammar rule in your memory, apply it to the sentence, make the changes. We don't have a lot of time in conversation. Now, the only time in real life when these conditions are met, when you know the rule, you're thinking about correctness, and you have time, is when we take a grammar test. When you take a grammar test, you've studied the rule, you're thinking about rules, and you have time to apply the rule. In our studies, we have found, and every teacher knows this, even when you give people a grammar test, they don't get everything right. They make lots and lots of mistakes. What I'm going to do today is focus on this very exciting chapter in our history, what happens when we read. Very important. My hypothesis is that a wonderful way to improve in a second language is what we call self-selected pleasure reading. Reading because you want to. Next slide, please. I love this method. Thank you so much. This is so good. Okay, self-selection is how we make sure the reading is interesting to us. I want to begin with the informal evidence here. I'm going to tell you what happened to me in secondary school, and I am predicting that the same thing happened to you. When I was in high school, secondary school in the United States, I took what we call English class. It was required. In English class, we read classic novels, the great novels. I read the books. I took tests on the books. I passed all the tests. I don't remember a single book that I read in secondary school English, not one. Please, think of your own experiences. If you remember a book or two, that's great, but that's about all for most people. What I remember is the books that I wanted to read myself. In fact, I remember nearly all of them. I read two kinds of books when I was a teenager. I read, first of all, science fiction. I read Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein, the great science fiction writers. I love it. In fact, in other languages, what I look for first is good science fiction. I just still love it. Um, Also, I read baseball stories. Can you believe that? And they were wonderful. I remember all of the baseball stories I read, absolutely. And I've reread many of these books over the years because they were deep and philosophical on ethics, how to live, etc. Also, some very good evidence that self-selection really counts is what happens when someone gives you a book as a gift. Someone gives me a book, says, Steve, this is going to be a great book. You're going to like it. And then what I fear is that a little while later, this friend will say, how did you like the book I gave you? And 9 times out of 10, I haven't read it. Here's a wonderful comment by an American humorist, Garrison Keillor. He says, as a former English major in school, people give me gift books. I'm a sitting duck, an easy target for gift books. In the past few years, I've gotten Dickens, Thackeray, Smollett, Richardson, Emerson, Keats, Boswell, and the Brontes, all of them great. None of them ever read by me. All of them now on my shelf, looking at me and making me feel guilty. I have the same shelf. Someone gives me a book, and if you open it up that says, Steve, I hope you like this. Okay. I take something, I cover that up, and I give the book to the library, right? Because now there are exceptions. There are some books that people have given me as gifts from some people, and those books are important to me because these are people who know me. Uh, there's one person in particular, when he recommends a book, I read it right away, and that's our son, because he understands me better than anybody, better than I understand myself. And he's always right on the book. Professional books, very often people make good suggestions, but in general, gift books show that we have to select books ourselves. Then it counts, then it's important. Okay. Um, Let me go to the next slide and start the parade of research. I'm going to give you a few examples from the gigantic research and the citations. You'll get more details on how to find the citations later. I'm going to give you just a few studies over the years. Let's look at DeVries' study, 1970. One of the reasons I like this study so much, it's only 2 pages long. Isn't that wonderful? And he cites other work that says the same thing. Anyway, DeVries taught language arts in the 5th grade, English for native speakers, and he divided to little kids, 10-year-old kids, and he divided them into 2 groups. One group got the typical assignment, 2 essays a week, and that was their class. The other group did no writing, but more reading that was interesting. They were given a test after 2 months. The group that only did writing did much better on accuracy, style, everything related to language. Our colleague Sian Lee from Taiwan has done a couple of studies that show this as well. In a major study, lots of statistics, etc. She found, this is for students of English as a as a foreign language in Taiwan, university level, the amount of reading that they did, this predicted how well they wrote. But the amount of writing they did on their own, leisure writing, no relationship. We find this in study after study. The next study that Dr. Lee did was to look at what self-selection did versus assigned reading. She taught a class in which the books were assigned, and the faculty, who were quite experienced and knew the students quite well, made sure the books would be interesting. Bestsellers, books based on current movies, and that was compared to complete self-selection. So even though they tried hard to get interesting books, the self-selected group did as well or better on the language test. The next one is one of my all-time favorites. Lin Shin and me. Shin is one of my former students, Fei Shin. She talked about a high school student who was fluent in English, but an interesting pattern. At the beginning of the year, they gave all the students tests of reading. Okay. At the beginning of the year, she got a score on a reading test. Then they gave them another test at the end of the year. She went down in reading comprehension during the year. Very mysterious. She would come back after the summer, take another test on reading comprehension. Her score was higher than it was the previous year. So she's had a test at the beginning, then she went down, then took another test the next fall. Her score was up higher than it was before. What was she doing over the summer? She went to the local public library and read for pleasure. She read all the books that young people like to read at this age. Some of you know the Sweet Valley series. This is not great literature. You know, the Nancy Drew mystery series. She read about 50 books on her own over the summer that she found at the public library. Her mom, who was the first author of the study, said, you know, maybe Sophia should stay home and not go to school. She's getting worse in reading over the year. Okay, more studies. This one was Beniko Mason's work, and I worked on it with her in one of the papers. Beniko Mason developed a method, and her method was the inspiration for what I do with my own Spanish. Once the students have reached the low intermediate stage, she starts a method called guided self-selected reading. She had an English library at her university in Japan with 5,000 graded readers. Isn't that delicious? The students could choose from 5,000 books. The teacher would help them choose to make sure the books were interesting to them. Here's what we found. She gave a sample of the students what we call the Toeic test. Some of you know about this. It's one of the most famous tests, listening, comprehension, and reading. It's from 250 to 1,000. If you get 250, you're ready to start reading. If you get 600, 700, 800, you're about ready to do academic work in English. Here's what we found. For every classroom hour of reading, the students gain more than a half of a point on the Toeic, 0.6 of a point. If you generalize this, extrapolate this, if students read for 2 hours a day over a year, say 300 days, they can go from low level after a while, just about up to the academic levels, to the highest levels, from reading alone, from doing this very pleasant activity, not from writing, getting your errors corrected, just from reading and enjoying yourself. No book report at the end, no assignment at the end, just read and enjoy yourself. This is a survey of the studies, not all of them. It's just to give you a sample. The next slide talks about the main point here, fiction. When we compare fiction reading and nonfiction, guess what wins? Fiction. The amount of fiction that people read is a better predictor than nonfiction. Again, this is not the only study. This is simply one of the most famous ones. Now, people are concerned about these findings. They say, well, if they read fiction and they enjoy themselves with nice stories, what kind of language are they getting? Okay, going to the next slide. The question is, what about academic language, the language you need for school? Well, there are lists of academic language, and you can see which are the ones, like 570 words, 485 words, etc. Um, what Jeff McQuillan has done, my former student at the university, now, of course, my colleague, when I discuss Jeff McQuillan, I said, I quote a line from Star Wars. I said, I was the master, you were the student. Now you are the master and I am the student, because he's done some absolutely wonderful work. And this is one of his many good papers. He looked at 22 novels that young people enjoy reading. He examined the vocabulary content using all kinds of fancy computer methods. If you read 22 novels, you get 85% of the academic words on the lists of academic words that people need for post-secondary instruction, and they appear enough times so they can be acquired. So this is very, very important. So if you do this pleasure reading and you understand it and you like the story, okay. Now, so far I have said that reading for pleasure gives you language. Well, we've got a long way to go. It's even better than that. Pleasure reading is, as we say, a gift that keeps on giving again and again. People who read more, next slide, please, know more. And this is the new stuff, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so excited about this research. Let me tell you, the privilege to tell you about it. People who read more, and what they read is fiction, know more about a lot of things. My goodness. This paper by Stanovich and Cunningham, I just really reread it about 3 months ago, just rediscovered it. I was so excited, I immediately contacted Jeff McQuillan. He said, my goodness, you're right. This is amazing. This is a fantastic result. He took college students, Stanovich and Cunningham, studied college students and gave them a wide variety of tests in many different areas: science, social studies, current events, personal finance, technology, cultural knowledge, multicultural, etc. Here are a couple of sample questions. What part of the body does the infection called pneumonia occur? Lungs, you didn't know. Economic questions. Where's the Panama Canal? Who was Linus Pauling? Who's Bertrand Russell? Etc. The next table, ladies and gentlemen. Stanovich and Cunningham also, if you go to the next table, you'll see a very important chart. The next slide, rather, you see a very important chart. They also looked at various predictors. Who knew more? High school grades didn't count. Here's a multiple regression analysis for both of you who remember your statistics class, okay? High school grade point, the grades you got was not a very good predictor. Raven matrices, that is supposedly a test of analytic thinking, not very good. Math test, very weak. Reading comprehension, not too good. Watching television, horrible, okay? The best predictor by far, reading. A test of print exposure, whether you recognize authors, whether you recognized great books, etc., magazines, books, titles, etc. That was by far the best predictor. The test they gave people, I think, captures what we want young people to know when they graduate high school, okay? This is profound. It comes from what you have read for pleasure, self-selected reading. Now, this is very consistent with recent research, again, which I have just discovered, on the impact of homework. And an amazing quote on the next slide, please. Okay. A book by Alfie Kohn, Kohn, called The Homework Myth. Does homework help? Kids do, an hour, 2 hours a day of homework, sometimes starting in grade 3, etc. More and more homework. Alfie Kohn, among others, has done a careful look at what the research on homework says. It's not worth it. There's no evidence of any academic benefit from homework at elementary or middle school. At the high school level, it's a weak correlation, and it doesn't hold up under more thorough statistical measures. People say, oh, homework's good because it gives you good habits and discipline. No study has supported this. So once again, pleasure reading loses out to school. If we reduce the amount of homework and we make pleasure reading more easy to do, more access, we're going to benefit. What an interesting result. There's more, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, I got another couple minutes and I'll finish up. People who read more have what we call more desirable habits of mind, which is on the next slide. People who read more understand other people better. When they read fiction, Terry Gross, a radio host here in Los Angeles, when you read fiction, you're learning to be somebody else, learning to see the world through their eyes. People who read more have a deeper understanding and appreciation of the complexity of life. They avoid simple solutions. Lots of research. I'm only going to give you one very expert opinion. Can't imagine anyone more expert than Barack Obama. He was interviewed by The Guardian. President Obama was asked about his reading and what was the most important. Here's what he says. The most important stuff I've learned, I think I've learned from novels. Empathy, being comfortable with the notion that the world is complicated, full of grays, but there's still truth there to be found. It's possible to connect with someone else, even though they're very different from you. Noam Chomsky came to a similar conclusion. He wrote, I think we will eventually discover more about humans and how we think from novels than from scientific psychology. My concluding comment, rather predictable. The first step in taking advantage of all this, access to books, supporting libraries. Make sure students have lots and lots of access to what they want to read, books that are desirable. Here is the work of Keith Curry Lance, an American researcher on libraries. Where do we find the best readers? We find the best readers in schools, among school children, that have good library collections and credentialed librarians that order the right books and that help students find the right books. Well, thank you for your patience. I've gone a little bit over. I got too enthusiastic. So the best, I think, is yet to come in our profession. We are slowly learning to unleash the wonderful power of self-selected pleasure reading. Thank you for your patience.
So much, Professor Stephen. Thank you. Now we can open the ground for the Q&A. Please feel free to write your question for us in the chat box, and we can direct it to Professor Stephen. Or if you prefer to use the mic, you can please just raise your virtual hand, and then you will be assigned the mic. You can find the virtual hand available at the bottom of the chat box in your right hand side. Right. Thank you so much. Now, okay, interesting. Let's please address some of the questions that we have received already. And the first one is by Michael Bowles. Michael is asking, for L2 learners, how important is it to read graded reading at the right level based on your receptive vocabulary knowledge?
Thank you for the question. It is exactly the right one. It's super important. Self-selection. What Benico Mason does is when the students are ready to start reading, she invites them to sit at a big table, small groups, with lots of graded readers spread out on the table. The students are free to sample them, pick them up. She knows the students very well. She can suggest books. And here's the important thing. You don't have to finish every book you start. You can try it out. You can take time and sample it. The same thing we do when we go to a bookstore. We try it out. Another thing we do is we take advantage of our friends. There's a wonderful method that a library teacher invented, and she wrote, Adriance is her name. She wrote a wonderful paper on it in the school library journal. Very simple things and cost absolutely nothing. Let me take a book here as an example. Here's a book I read in Spanish. Adriana Ramirez, one of my favorite authors. What they do is they read the book. If they like it, they take their pen and they put a star in the inside cover. That's it. The cost is zero. Students go to the library, they find a book with 10 stars. It's a recommendation. So we let students help each other. We don't do book reports, papers, assignments. Simply say, this book was good. I liked it. Some of the books in the library will have 15, 20 stars. Some won't have any. That gives other students a pretty good idea. Yes, thank you for that comment. Much more efficient than book reports. Okay. The last thing we ever want to do, we want to go on and read some more. Okay, next question. We're off to a good start.
Okay, the next question is from Samahari Jabri, and she is asking, how can readers avoid mind wandering when they read?
Okay, you can avoid your mind wandering through self-selection. If your mind wanders, maybe that's not the right book. That was a great question. Exactly. Oh, there's another one that just came up. Let me jump to this one. Is there a difference between digital books and hard copy books? Let me give you my sophisticated expert answer coming from years of research. I don't know. I have no idea. The research has not been done. I kind of doubt that there's a big difference as a reader. We get very used to reading digital. I sure hope that digital works because it's a wonderful way of getting lots of print into the lives of people very quickly and easily. So great question. I don't know the answer. Let's find out.
Okay, that's great. So ready for the next question? And
Next.
the next question is, how come polyglots acquire and are fluent in, say, 8 or 22 languages, accent, okay, in addition to the language acquisition, is their language acquisition different from others?
Very good question. Again, this one I've studied a lot, and I have written papers about polyglots. I have met them. And what I've discovered is that polyglots have the same brain we do. They know how to do it. Lom Kato, the first polyglot I met who knew about 20 languages, she said, there's nothing different about me. I just know what to do. Okay. And her favorite technique, reading, reading, reading for pleasure in other languages all the time. Other polyglots have told me the same thing. Steve Kaufman knows about 20 languages, and I have been with him when he's speaking these languages. It's just remarkable. Okay. Uh, Reading is extremely important to him, always reading. He reads in Chinese, he reads in French, he reads in Spanish. And I have been with him when he's speaking these languages, and it's just absolutely amazing. He has given me, well, I've heard him give this great advice. He says, don't worry as a polyglot being perfect. Don't worry about getting everything right. Don't worry about making mistakes. Nobody cares. Isn't that wonderful? He says, no, they're more
Very much.
interested in what you're saying rather than how you're saying it. Another great piece of advice from Steve Kaufman. He says, when I'm reading in another language and I come to a word I don't know in the text, if I look it up in the dictionary, by the time I get back to the book, I have forgotten the word. He says, if I don't look up words, I enjoy the reading much, much more. And each time you see the word in print and you kind of understand it, you get a little bit. And over time, you build up a huge vocabulary. All the polyglots have told me we are not special. There's nothing different about our brains. They have the same brains that we do. They simply get more input and they know how to do it. And then again, great question.
Right. And another question now by Mudesser Mushtaq, who is asking, textbooks which are based on literature for ALT pose problems for students who want to read essays or topics from their own fields, such as social sciences, for example.
Good.
How can a teacher motivate students in such a context or in such situations?
Well, I'll answer two parts of that question. What we want is for people eventually, certainly, to read in their specialty. Okay. I do lots of reading in other languages about language acquisition, especially if they talk about me. I always read the article. All right. Now, I got the fluency for this and the competence by reading lots of easy fiction. One study um, found that if you read 1 million words of science fiction, about a year's reading, you gain the academic vocabulary you need for all areas of science. Isn't that wonderful? Do pleasure reading, and it will give you the competence to eventually read in your specialty. Very, very nice. The world is designed to give us an easy path for English for special purposes. So easy reading first, and then move on to your specialty. Great question. These are wonderful questions. Thank you. A+ on questions today.
Great. And we can take some of the questions from the list, people raising their hands.
Thank you, Professor Krashen, for this very informative presentation. So my question is, while I see the connection between self-selected reading and language acquisition, I would like to hear your opinion about the role of participating in activities like book clubs to discuss the reading. Would you say that such activities can actually help test, develop, and or validate that acquisition?
Great question. Another good, you guys, you get A+ on questions today. This is wonderful. Again, I will give you my expert opinion based on years of research. I don't know. There's been no study of book clubs. That would be a wonderful study. I suspect that it would be very helpful because you get to meet people who have similar tastes as you do, similar, ideas that they want to read about, and you get to know about more literature of the kind you want to read. So I suspect it will work. I don't know about studies. There have been very, very few, a few here and there. Beatrice Dupuy has done research on this. Very good, but we need much, much more. So this is an invitation to do more research. Great question.
Another question from Muftah Hamid, who's asking, do you think that pleasure self-selected reading is beneficial for first-year university students with beginner proficiency level?
Probably not. It's probably going to be much too difficult. What Dr. Mason does is have a lot of sessions of listening to stories that the teacher makes comprehensible. What Dr. Mason does, she prepares stories for beginning level students, carefully selects them, stories of universal interest like Grimm fairy tales, etc. And she knows which words are going to be difficult. She'll have pictures, she'll draw pictures, etc., explain them. She did it in Japan when she was teaching EFL and had the same language as her students. So occasionally she'd give an occasional translation when a word was tough, but not very often. Stories. For beginners, listening to good stories. Everybody likes to hear stories. The research on first language development says 90% of children say they love it when mommy and daddy read stories or tell stories to them. The 10% who don't like it, the parents don't like to read stories. I find that hard to believe, hard to imagine anyway. But stories, listening to stories is always very pleasant, and it builds language, grammar, vocabulary, etc. So good question. Thanks for bringing this up. I should have mentioned it. The first stage, stories, listening to stories. Many beginning language teaching methods today use stories at the beginning level. I think that's a huge step in the right direction. Thanks for asking.
And another question by Ahmed El-Janadba, who is asking, can you please comment about using translanguaging in teaching L2 language from very low level to advanced levels?
Okay, translanguaging, was that the word? I've had a hard time understanding what that means. New terminology puzzles me like it puzzles you. But if I do understand it correctly, it means using the first language correctly to make second language input more comprehensible. If we give people lots of information in the beginning, then what they read in the second language will be more comprehensible. What we do in bilingual programs, you first make sure the students get lots of input in the primary home language. When you get input in the primary home language, you develop literacy. Literacy transfers across languages. I co-authored a study on this. This was Spanish English children in the United States. Their ability to read in Spanish in second grade predicted their ability to read in English in the sixth grade. Other people have found this. This is an idea pioneered by Professor Jim Cummins from Canada, a breakthrough idea. We also like people to have subject matter knowledge in the first language. So reading for pleasure in the first language is going to be a powerful, powerful help for everything. More knowledge, the world is more comprehensible. Second language reading, second language input in general will be more comprehensible. Thank you for the question, everyone.
Nagakala, now you can ask.
My question is, when compared to Westerners, Easterners have a problem in reading, in the sense like they don't read much. Only the prescribed books will be read by the students. So is there any motivational or inspirational ideas to motivate our students to read more?
Thank you very much.
I have to keep complimenting the questions, and that's real. The questions are just exactly right, my opinion. How do we motivate reading? Several ways. Read aloud, telling stories, okay? Putting stars in the book so students can see which ones have been successful. Time to browse in the library, time to look at books, try them out, and knowing that you don't have to read every book, then that you start. These are the ways to do it, and having lots of good books available, librarians know exactly what to do. They display the good books, the popular ones, etc. And I'll introduce a vocabulary word that you may have heard. Comic books. Comic books for sure. There was a wonderful study done in American high school about 20 years ago. These are for young teenagers. They put comic books in the school library, graphic novels, but did not allow them to circulate. You had to go to the library to read the comic and sit down and read it. They found a huge increase over 2 months in library traffic. Far more kids came into the library, and circulation of non-comic book material went up about 30%. Make sure there's good stuff to read, make it available, give students time and place to read it, and reading will improve. We all know there's nothing more exciting than a new graphic novel that has encouraged so many people to read. And again, the quality, even the quality of comic books has increased enormously. The breakthrough came in 1961, the beginning of the Marvel comic book company, and for the English-speaking world and all over the world, where we had heroes, superheroes with problems, real-life stories, got very interesting. So yes, delicious, wonderful reading that they can't wait to read. Make it available, time and a place to read.
We have got Abdel Fattah. Abdel Fattah, you can now ask your question, please.
My question is, can learners learn or acquire a foreign language by just being exposed to comprehensible input till the language comes naturally, or they need to take risks by trying to produce the language, even if they are beginners? In other words, should teachers impose on their students to produce the language or not?
Okay, let me give you the evidence. There is something called forced speech. Forced speech is when you have to speak in the language and you have not acquired what you need. You've consciously learned it, but you haven't acquired it. I wrote a paper on this called Down with Forced Speech. It's going to be on the bibliography, as you see. This all began for me, I'd say about 45 years ago, and my daughter is the hero of the story. My daughter had gone down the street to play with a neighborhood child in a family we knew very, very well. And my job was to go to the house and pick up my daughter and her friend and bring them to my house because the mom of her friend had to go do something else. So I went over and I was ready to take the two young ladies, about 6 years old, to our house. And the mom said, wait, I've got to go take my pill before we leave, before you leave with the girls. She runs into the kitchen, gets water, takes a pill. And again, these were very close family friends. Okay. And I said, what was that all about? What are you taking? She said, I'm taking Valium. That's like Prozac, anti-anxiety medication. And I said, what's going on? She said, well, I'm going to my Spanish class at the community college, and Spanish class makes me very nervous. So I asked her why.
الهوست فخليه هو يحول.
So I said, what is it about Spanish class? Having to speak in class, being called on in class, just the situation the question is about, or having to do an oral report. People get very nervous. What we have found from looking at natural language acquisition in the environment, normal environment, people don't talk right away. They have a silent period. There's a study in a group in Africa, in the Amazon Valley, where a small group of people, this is an anthropologist named Sorensen, looked at 10,000 people in a very small area. 10,000 is not a lot. If you go to a football game, there's 10,000 people watching the game, okay? They found in this area, there were 10,000 people speaking 24 different languages. And there was a very strange rule in this culture. You may not marry anyone who speaks your language. They regarded outsiders as really misbehaving. This isn't right. I married my wife 55 years ago, and we speak the same first language. That would be forbidden in this culture. How did they do it? The people in this culture became profoundly multilingual. They acquired languages their whole lives. Mommy's language, daddy's language, the language of the small group, the larger group. How did they do it? They didn't talk right away. They said, we just listen for a while. We don't try speaking until it comes easily. It might be a year or two or even more before we even try to speak. We can do better than this because we have language classes. And language classes, you can get comprehensible input that the outside world will not give you. So this is true in our research. Classes in which students have to talk right away, students get very, very nervous, which shows you something is wrong. Our neighbor was absolutely right. This is very difficult when someone asks you to talk and you're not ready. Give them time, give them more input.
Okay, Professor Christina is asking about digital books. She's saying digital books on iPad allows students to look up words, choose to listen to the book, and then read it, which is useful for interactive reading, especially for kids. However, parents are worried about children spending very long time and too much time on front of the screen of the iPad. So what advice would you like to give to parents?
Well, I have no knowledge of the dangers of watching a screen. I don't know what the research says on this, but so many people do it so often all the time, it couldn't be that bad. So my hunch is that the idea of the screen, having a device where you can read books, is certainly probably doing literacy a lot of good. But let me invite you to do the research. This is a wonderful area for research. How much reading do people do in print? How much do they do on screens? Is it comfortable? Are there any, ask the medical profession, are there any problems? I really don't know. My guess is that it's okay. My guess is that it works. I am old and old-fashioned, and I like, the actual book, etc. But that doesn't mean everybody has to do it. It's a wonderful area for research. Great question. Thank you.
Najmuddin is asking, do classical literature have more impact on imagination, vocabulary, etc., than contemporary literature?
I have found I don't know. But my own finding is that contemporary popular literature can be very, very good. Again, I'll give you my case. I have to, as of about 2 years ago, I was driving all the time from where I lived into Los Angeles City. We live about, I'd say 40 kilometers from Santa Monica, the closest part of Los Angeles. And I went there twice a week regularly, driving. And I went there for two reasons. Well, number one is my addiction to my grandchildren, and they live in Santa Monica, so I had to go there. And the other thing is I went, as you can tell, I went to lift weights at Gold's Gym and on the beach, etc. So what do you do in the car for 40 minutes twice a week? I don't like listening to the news. It's the same Donald Trump over and over again. I've had enough. Okay. Music has changed. I love listening to the best popular and classical music, but the regular radio programs no longer have the good music. They have changed that to radio stations you have to pay for. And the ones you get to free are not the best music. So if you want to get the classics like the Beatles, you have to pay for it, okay? Anyway, so I started stopping at the local library. I started stopping there and took out books on disc and audio books. I always went to the Santa Monica Library because my daughter used to work there and it was nice to see her on the way in. And here's what I found. The books available for listening in the car are not the classics. They're only in English, and they're always bestsellers. So that's what I listened to. I discovered, to my amazement, they were good. Not every one of them, but popular bestsellers, very good. I listened to historical novels. I listened to crime novels. I listen to thrillers about court cases and legal cases. I don't care about the law and studying, but these books were so good, so well written. I got a lot of information, which helped me when I served on a jury. I knew more about all this stuff, and it was very pleasurable. What has happened to me, by the way, the first one I read was Harry Potter. I wound up listening, not reading, listening. I listened to all 7 Harry Potter novels in the car. I found them to be excellent. Those of us who are educators and listen and watch and read Harry Potter know all about it. J.K. Rowling writes about education. It takes place at Hogwarts, a school where you learn what goes on in classes. The hero of several of the books is the headmaster, Dumbledore. For us, this is absolutely perfect. There's a lot of discussion about good teaching, bad teaching. One of my students wrote an essay in one of my classes. The hero is Harry Potter, and one of his best friends is a young lady named Hermione, who turns out to be the perfect student. She raises her hand all the time, knows the answers. My student's essay was, is Hermione smart? Is this what we want from our students? Very interesting question. So I found the popular literature to be very, very good, and I still do. It was quite a lesson for me to see what so-called people are reading. In fact, these books are so good. What happened to me has happened to you. I would drive home, get home, park the car in front of the house, and stay in the car for another minute or so to hear the end of the chapter. This has happened to you too. So yes, I think popular literature can be extremely good. So I would never reject it. I'm not saying every popular book is good. I'm sure that's not true, but I have listened to and now read quite a few very good books. In terms of popular children's literature, I go to a lot of conferences, or used to before COVID, and as guest speakers, the conferences on children's literature would invite authors of children's literature. Every one of them was a brilliant speaker. Every one of them had wonderful things to say, good stories, etc. So I have developed a deep respect for popular literature. That's my answer.